Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy day 13 of the lockdown. We are really getting into our stride now. Today's Wednesday, the 8th of April. This is halfway through what is actually a short week, which you might or might not have remembered, as this weekend is a long weekend. In the last video on managing morale, we spoke a little bit about cognitive techniques such as framing. And in this vein, it's quite interesting to think a month ago how many of us would have been so looking forward to having a long weekend, even if it meant we were just going to be spending it at home. But here we are. And have you framed it in a different way right now? Are you thinking about this weekend as more of a burden, perhaps, or something that you have to kind of get through, something you have to survive, as opposed to the really restful time that you were hoping it would be? So yeah, that's just a way of thinking about it again, and that's the power of framing. The benefit of being aware of this framing of a situation means we can either introduce a solution focused mindset, or we can stick to thinking about things with a problem mindset and identifying all the negativity and identifying all of the obstacles that are in the way and all the challenges, as opposed to, well, how do we actually think about this in a positive way? How do we actually get through this? How do we find the opportunities here? So today we're going to look a little bit closer at a few techniques in positive psychology. These can be helpful in times of hardship or in times of increased feelings of powerlessness. This was originally just meant to be a single video. However, as I began preparing it, I realized that this was not really possible to do it justice. And more than that, it's an area that I'm really interested in, I'm very passionate about. So I thought that as a result, let's make this 2 videos rather. At least we might even get into 3, but let's see how we go. So this is part 1 of that video in the lockdown video series. So positive psychology emerged in the latter part of last century. It came out of the realization by psychologists that psychology doesn't just need to focus on diagnosing and treating psychological disorders and the associated suffering with that, but rather could be used to provide research and guidance into maximizing happiness and well-being. So a lot of research has been done since then on how to live a life that's not just free of pathology and symptomology, but how to thrive. So positive psychology is about living an examined life and building our strengths. And it's about putting the building blocks in place for that type of meaningful existence. So, as you can no doubt see, the clue is in the name. Positive psychology is indeed just that. It is positive, and because of its very uplifting nature, it's attracted a huge amount of interest because people want to explore this part of humanity. And this research has been extensive over the last few decades, and as such, there's naturally a lot to speak about. But in these videos, I'm just going to cover a few of the kind of core techniques, and especially ones that I find helpful with clients in my practice. So as we talk about it, you might notice that there's some overlaps between positive psychological techniques and Eastern contemplative religious practices, traditions, such as Buddhism, for example. What we're finding is that large portions of the practices of the ancients do stand up to empirical testing, and these techniques are practiced widely in Western psychology today. One can imagine there might be a certain amount of figurative eye rolling from those that have been finding these practices integral to their well-being for millennia. But be that as it may, let's get into it. So firstly, and really what we're going to spend most of this video discussing is self-compassion. This is the big one. Kristin Neff is the guru on self-compassion in modern psychology today. So if this is something you're interested in and want to explore further, there are a lot of really helpful videos and talks and articles online on this topic of self-compassion by Kristin Neff and by people who have been inspired by her work. So self-compassion essentially is built on the process of understanding the relationship that we have with ourselves. So in the same way that we have relationships with other people in our lives, we of course have a relationship with ourselves, and that we have a certain attitude towards ourselves. We treat ourselves in a certain way. And without realizing it, we often have very different expectations of our behavior and we set much higher standards for ourselves than we do for others in our lives. So as a result of this, our internal dialogue can be very critical and judgmental. It can be harsh. As we focus on our failures, we focus on our shortcomings, we focus on the negative feedback instead of instead of focusing on the achievement and the accomplishments, and we downplay the positive feedback that we receive from the world and people in specific. So you can do this thought experiment. Think about the labels that you have for yourself when you make mistakes. Think about the rules and permissions you set for how you are allowed to handle difficulties and show your feelings, the difficult feelings in these times. So would you apply these same rules and permissions and expectations to people in your life that you care for and that you love? Would you berate them for the mistakes they make in the same way? Would you love them less if they achieved less at work, or if they displayed their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses? As you start to do this experiment, you start to see the hypocrisy of our approach towards ourselves. This comes into stark relief. And that's a really helpful tool, I think, is to be able to think about the way that you care for people in your life that are important to you, and use that as a template for, or a frame maybe, for understanding how you interact with yourself and the attitude you have towards yourself. And that can give you some perspective on that, because we so readily fall into the sense of normality, and we just think, well, this is how I should be treating myself. This is normal because I've always done it. It feels right. But of course, not everything that feels right is necessarily good for us or healthy. So the effects of self-compassion are very well established. We know that low self-compassion is negatively correlated to childhood traumas, neglect, or abuse. So the more neglect, abuse, trauma, the more significant this was in our childhood, the more likely we are to present with lower levels of self-compassion. This follows, if you think about it, because the way we relate to ourselves, the attitude we have towards ourselves, is not something we are born programmed with in its entirety, but of course it's something that we learn, and we learn this through how we are treated by other people during the formative years of our life, because the messaging that we're receiving there is, what are we worthy of, what do we deserve, and then we often use that as a template, and we model our own relationship on ourselves with that without necessarily realizing that's what we're doing. Again, it just feels normal. It feels that this is the way it should be done. And until we can introduce an awareness, then we just do that blindly, thinking that this is how it should be. So low levels of self-compassion are linked with lower self-esteem, an impaired ability to thrive, to be joyful, and this of course means an increased likelihood of developing disorders such as anxiety and depression, which are very normal human disorders. They have good reasons for them, and we understand them well, and we understand that there are ways of treating them and recovering from them. Self-compassion is about recalibrating the attitude we have towards ourselves, and this is something that is very possible to do. Because it's learned for the most part, this is what research suggests, because it's learned for the most part, it is possible to unlearn it, it is possible to learn other ways of engaging with who we are. So it's not about pity. That's an important point. Self-pity is not self-compassion. So pity is about victimhood. It's about blame. It's about being stuck in the past. Compassion is just about kindness and warmth and understanding. So there are three aspects to it which are helpful to think about in terms of self-compassion, which we'll just talk through briefly before concluding. So the first aspect is to think about self-kindness versus self-judgment. So this means treating ourselves with care and understanding, especially when we're going through difficult times or when we've made a mistake. So it's easy to minimize our feelings in these situations, to punish ourselves, to be very harsh on ourselves for our shortcomings. But all this does is it amplifies the unhappiness that we were already feeling from the situation. So we have the situational unhappiness, and then we amplify it with this narrative that we tell ourselves, and this criticism that we have, this feeling of dissatisfaction with ourselves. So that's the first aspect, self-kindness. The second one is about acknowledging our common humanity. So this is just about kind of walking through a few very simple logical steps. So acknowledging, as we all do, as we all can do, that humans suffer. This is part of being human, is that suffering comes with a package. It's part of living. That's the first step. The second step is to say, well, what we also know is that all humans make mistakes. No one is perfect, and this is okay. We expect it. Obviously, the way those mistakes are managed, that matters, but ultimately we are all going to make mistakes. So once we acknowledge those two things, that all humans suffer and that all humans make mistakes, the next step is to say, I too am human. And this might sound self-evident or even trite, but it's something that we often overlook because we kind of have this idea, this cognitive dissonance, that we know that we're human, we know that we're the same as everybody else, but yet we treat ourselves by a different set of rules. We have different expectations for ourselves. That's fine for everybody else, but not for me. So I expect everybody else to speak about their problems when they have them and to be open and honest and to reach out for help, but not me. I can get through them myself. I can be strong. These two ideas are in conflict. And once we acknowledge we are human, that's a really important part of bridging this self-compassion, because we start to see then that we are also due what other humans are due. We also deserve what other humans deserve, and that's a very important belief in itself. Because of that, we don't live by a separate set of rules, but we can allow ourselves to feel this common humanity, which is a human need. And also we don't let our suffering isolate us, because it's so easy to feel alone in our unhappiness because we put up the walls and we put on the mask and no one knows how we're really feeling. Finally, the last part of self-compassion is having a healthy relationship with our emotional experience, or the way we feel. We'll speak a bit more about this in the next video when we speak about mindfulness. Mindfulness is the tool for doing this, but ultimately what we're talking about here is finding a balance, an equilibrium. And there's two, we can think of it on a continuum. There's two different extremes. One of them is we suppress our feelings, we push them down, our uncomfortable feelings, we deny our emotional experience. That's the one extreme. And the other extreme is we over-identify with our pain. We focus on our pain and our misfortune and how unlucky we are. So both ends of this continuum can contribute to unhappiness, of course, because in the first case, what it means is we have this accumulation of unresolved emotional conflict. They run in the background, they weigh us down, they contribute to general feelings of sadness, and they all tend to come up every time there's a new challenge. So that in itself is problematic. It's common, so many people do it, but it can be a recipe for unhappiness. The other end of the continuum, which is over identifying with our misery, this introduces a narrative of victimhood where we feel we kind of swept away by the negativity, and this takes away, it robs us of hope, it robs us of the ability to trust people, and it takes away the ability to find meaning in our suffering, which is so important, because again, suffering is part of life, and if we can find meaning through it, that's what allows us to not only be able to survive it, but also to be able to grow through it. So last thought is a lack of self-compassion is often seen as a necessary way of achieving success. So we have it written into our rule book for ourselves. Well, I don't want to be too easy on myself because then I'm going to be complacent or I'm not going to get the things that I want in life. And there's an element of truth in this. There's that so-called kernel of truth, which is not to say that the premise itself is true. But the reason we can say, well, why people think that way is, well, of course, a lack of self-compassion can be functional. It can result in drive and motivation and ambition. But ultimately, it's a toxic motivator. It damages whilst it motivates. So there's this fire inside of ourselves, sure, but that fire burns us at the same time. A lot of successful people do have low levels of self-compassion. That's true. But tragically, these people are often not happy in their success. So success is one thing. If we can't be happy in our success, then that in itself is not optimal. So it is possible to be very successful and accomplished and to strive for excellence, to have drive and ambition, but also to have self-compassion. And this is a more sustainable approach. So let us leave it there for today. My name is James Sturdy. I'm with the Region Business School Counseling Services. If you'd like to discuss any more of this in any more detail with relation to yourselves, feel free to set up an appointment for counseling on counseling@regent.ac.za. And if anything that was discussed during this video brings up any type of emotional discomfort as well, feel free to reach out and set up that appointment, and we can talk about it more in a confidential setting, one-on-one. Next session, we'll look a little bit at other techniques such as mindfulness, gratitude, how to live a meaningful life, other techniques in psychology that are positive and uplifting. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your short week.